They will tell you I took England with a single decision. One sharp turn of the wheel and history followed. A horse made ready in the dark, a winter crossing, a few doors opened at the right moment. That's how chronicles like their kings. Clean lines, simple causes, tidy endings. But if you want the truth, the kind that still makes sense to a modern mind, then start where certainty dies. Start in the hour after a great man stops breathing, when everyone in the room pretends not to be afraid. King Henry I, my uncle, was gone. No trumpet announced it, no angel lowered a banner. There was only the quiet, a quiet that spread through the court like cold water over hot stone. Men who had spent their lives measuring power suddenly discovered they had nothing solid beneath their feet. I watched their eyes, and I learned something that day. Grief comes later. First comes arithmetic. Who inherits? Who commands? Who dares? You might call it a succession crisis. We didn't have such neat words for it. To us, it felt like a lock had snapped inside the kingdom. Every door in England had become a temptation. I was in Normandy when the news reached me. Count of Boulogne, nephew of the dead king, husband, father. I had a reputation for fairness, for a kind of charm that made people feel safe. And I'll admit it, I had always been slightly too ready to believe that the world rewards virtue. But virtue does not choose kings. Timing does. Henry had demanded oaths to his daughter, the Empress Matilda. Great lords had sworn. Bishops had sworn. Even I had sworn. Yes, I did. And yet, an oath is not a chain if the hand that holds it is gone. That is the brutal logic of the 12th century. And if you look at it with modern eyes, it's also a warning. Promises cannot replace institutions. England did not yet have institutions strong enough to outlive a king's lungs. In the candlelit chamber where council gathered, I listened to men speak about the next weeks as if the future were already settled. Some said Matilda would take the throne. Some said the barons would refuse her. Some said Normandy would fracture and England would follow. Each voice carried its own fear, dressed up as advice. Then someone said the thing no one wanted to admit out loud. If you do not go now, someone else will. History loves that line. It turns men into storm riders. It makes the act sound inevitable. But inevitability is a story told backward. In the moment, I felt something smaller and more shameful. Not destiny, opportunity, a heat under the ribs, a spark that made my heart strike faster. I imagined England, its ports, its coin, its authority, slipping into other hands, into hands that would not hesitate the way I did. So I told myself I was going to prevent chaos. Every ambitious man tells himself that. That night, as preparations began in whispers, I found myself staring at the object that would later follow me into rumor and song. My sword. You might be expecting a relic, something displayed behind glass, labeled in careful script, Stephen's blade. There is no such certainty. No museum holds the unbreakable sword. What survives are words, flattering, stubborn words, copied at candlelight by people who wanted their kings to resemble saints more than men. But I did have a sword. A lord without a blade is a bell without a tongue, present but unable to speak. It lay on a dark cloth. The metal looked almost black in the low light. The hilt was plain, no jeweled vanity. I preferred it that way. A ruler who shines too brightly invites hands that want to test how easily he scratches. A priest once told me that iron remembers, that if a weapon is made in prayer, it holds the prayer like a hidden letter, and in the hour of need, that letter can be opened. You may smile at that. You live in an age that demands proof. Yet even you keep rituals. Lucky shirts, inherited rings, habits before risk. The difference is only language. We called it grace. You might call it psychology. In Boulogne, there had been an old smith, Flemish by birth, steady-eyed, missing 2 fingers. He spoke little, but once, while cooling the blade, he murmured words not meant for me. Not for breaking, for holding. I asked what he meant. He shrugged as smiths do when they've said more than they intended. He muttered, "A sword breaks when the man breaks, and sometimes the man breaks first." I carried that line with me, though I didn't yet understand it. Before dawn, I was moving. Ships were made ready, coins counted, messages sent to men who might become allies, and to allies who might become something less reliable than friends. The sea between Normandy and England is a thin strip of water with a wide appetite. Men have drowned there with prayers on their lips and maps in their pockets. I crossed anyway. The wind fought us like an argument that refuses to end. Salt stung my eyes. The deck rolled beneath my boots as if the world itself was trying to shake me loose before I could do what I had come to do. And in that crossing, between one shore and another, I thought of Matilda. Not as a distant rival, not as a name on parchment, but as a woman with a claim. Henry's daughter, empress, widow of an emperor, bride to Geoffrey of Anjou, a man many Norman lords distrusted. Her right was strong, lawful, the kind later centuries admire. But she carried something heavier than law. She carried the reality of being a woman in a world that treated rule as a man's body. The barons would not say it so plainly, of course. They would hide it behind talk of custom, behind worry over foreign influence, behind arguments that sounded principled. With modern eyes, the pattern is clear. When power feels threatened, people invent principles to make fear look respectable. When the white cliffs finally rose through the haze, I felt not triumph but urgency. London was the heart that could pump legitimacy through the body of the kingdom. Winchester held the treasury. Canterbury held blessing. I needed them all, quickly, before doubt gathered itself into an army. We landed. We rode. Villages watched us pass with the cautious stare of people who have learned that noble urgency often becomes peasant suffering. I wanted to tell them I would be different. I wanted to believe it myself. The road was winter hard. Mud, ruts, bare hedges, cold breath. The pace had to be fast, but not reckless. Armor is heavy. Horses tire. Men make mistakes when they're hungry and wet. Leadership isn't only about boldness. It's about arriving with enough strength left to be believed. I thought again of that oath I had sworn to Matilda. I didn't forget it. I simply felt it change shape inside me, like metal under heat. Because another truth became impossible to ignore. The realm's obedience was not guaranteed to her, and it would not wait politely for a lawful solution. It would go to whoever could make the future feel less frightening. So I rode toward London with a hard, private understanding. The first battle would not be fought with blades. It would be fought with time. And somewhere behind me, in the minds of men who needed certainty, the story was already taking its first breath. A story about a man who moved faster than hesitation. A story about a crown taken before it could be taken by another. And yes, a story about a sword. Not because the steel was enchanted, not because iron ignores the laws of the world, but because people were already searching for something that couldn't break, something steady enough to lean on. As the gates and streets of England drew closer, I felt the weight of everything I was about to ask of this kingdom, and I realized that what I carried at my hip was not merely a weapon. It was a promise, one I wasn't sure any man could keep. But I had crossed the water. I had chosen my path. Now all that remained was to see whether England would open its doors or close them forever. London didn't greet me like a conqueror. It greeted me like a possibility. That difference matters. A conqueror forces a city to kneel. A possibility invites a city to place a bet. And London, merchant-proud, crowded, sharp-eyed, has always understood wagers. I rode in under low winter light, through streets that smelled of smoke and wet timber. People watched the way traders watch a new coin, turning it in the mind, measuring its weight, asking whether it's real. They listened to my promises with the same care they used for prices and contracts. They asked about order, about coin, about whether roads would be safe enough for trade, about courts, whether the king's justice would still speak clearly, or whether every dispute would become another private bargain behind locked doors. Their loyalty wasn't sentimental, it was practical, and in that moment I respected them for it. It was the most honest loyalty a ruler can hope to earn. Then came the bishops. In my time, the church was the closest thing England had to permanence. Kings rose and fell, barons changed sides, castles changed hands. But a bishop's seal could make a claim feel lawful, and a blessing could make a choice feel like destiny. If you want a modern comparison, think of it as control of the story. Who gets to say what is legitimate, what is lawful, what is meant to be? In a realm where institutions were still young, narrative carried real force. The bishops looked at me with calm faces, as if the entire matter could be settled by careful words. And then they asked the question that hung behind every meeting, every nod, every half-smile. "What of your oath to the Empress Matilda?" I did not deny it. I could not. Too many had heard me swear. Instead, I did what ambitious men always do when the ground shifts beneath them. I reframed the oath. I spoke of the realm's stability, of the baron's doubts, of the danger of division. I suggested, carefully, that vows made under pressure might not bind a kingdom when the kingdom itself was at risk. I said what people wanted to hear, because people listen hardest to the words that soothe their fear. I will be a shield against chaos, I told them. And in truth, I was stepping into chaos and hoping my name could hold it still. The day of my coronation came like a storm dressed as ceremony. Westminster's stones swallowed sound. Incense drifted through the air and clung to the back of the throat. Oil glistened on skin, a ring pressed onto a finger, a scepter placed into a hand. Words spoken with the confidence of men who believed heaven paid close attention to English politics. I knelt. I rose. The crown settled onto my head with a weight that was both physical and symbolic. For a moment, it felt like clarity. I am the king. Then doubt returned, quietly, like a cough in a silent room. Because power is not a crown. Power is compliance, and compliance is rented, not owned. That evening, after the feasting and the formal faces, I finally stood alone long enough to hear my own thoughts again. I unbuckled my sword belt and let the blade rest across my knees. People later spoke as if my sword were something extraordinary, as if it carried a miracle in its edge. But the truth is simpler. The sword was good, well-made, plain, dependable, the sort of weapon a practical lord would choose. What I began to understand in the quiet of that chamber was not the strength of the metal. It was the hunger people had for certainty. What would it mean for a sword to not break? If you take it literally, it becomes sorcery, and I was no sorcerer. Even the best steel can fail. Bad angle, hidden flaw, sheer strain. Iron doesn't care about our hopes. It's honest that way. But a story can do what metal cannot. A story can refuse to bend. A story can make a man seem steadier than he is, and make a realm feel safer than it truly is. And in those first days, I could feel stories gathering around me like mist. A young soldier came to my door, not a great knight, not a lord, just one of the many men who would carry the kingdom's burdens on his back. He asked, carefully, as if he feared being rude, whether he might see the king's blade. I let him in. I drew the blade part way, just enough for candlelight to run along its edge. He studied it, and his face tightened with disappointment. "It looks ordinary," he said. "It is ordinary," I told him. "That is the point." He frowned. "They say it cannot break." I almost laughed, not because he was foolish, but because the need in his voice was so familiar. People do not ask for invincible kings because they enjoy fantasy. They ask because they are afraid. "Everything breaks," I said quietly. "The question is what you do when it happens." He didn't understand, or perhaps he understood too well and didn't want to push his luck by asking a king to explain his own fear. After he left, I sat with the sword and the silence, and I thought of Matilda again, not as a distant rival, but as a real person with a real claim. Henry's daughter, Empress, a woman with the sort of lawful right that later centuries admire. But law is only one part of rule. Acceptance is the other. And in my England, acceptance could be withheld for reasons no one wanted to confess openly. That is where a modern lens becomes useful. We like our history clean, rightful heir, false usurper, good side, bad side. But real succession crises are rarely so tidy. Henry wanted Matilda to succeed. The realm did not want her strongly enough. I stepped into the gap, part ambition, part pragmatism, part fear. Outside the palace, England carried on. Markets opened, bargains were struck, children ran between legs. Somewhere, a woman argued over the price of grain as if kings were weather, important but not hers to control. And yet, the first fractures were already forming. A baron delayed his oath, another fortified a tower for safety. Messengers began traveling with guarded eyes. Small acts, each one explainable on its own, forming a pattern when taken together. That is how a kingdom begins to crack. Not with a single dramatic moment, but with tiny hesitations multiplying across the land.
I could feel the future gathering. I could feel it the way you feel thunder before you hear it. A pressure in the air, a tightening in the chest, the sense that something large is moving towards you through darkness. So I began to understand what the old smith might have meant years earlier when he spoke over cooling iron. He said, not for breaking, for holding. At the time, I thought he meant the blade. Now, wearing a crown that felt heavier by the hour, I started to wonder if he meant the man.
The first lesson of a disputed crown is this: you don't rule a kingdom, you chase it. In the months after my coronation, England felt like a great house whose master had died without leaving a clear key. On paper, every door belonged to me. In practice, I rode from shire to shire and found locks that had quietly been changed. A lord would delay his oath until things settled. A castellan would strengthen a gate for safety. A sheriff would behave as if he were a small king. Each act, taken alone, sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern, a country testing whether my authority was real or only a ceremony remembered in London. If you look at it with modern eyes, you can see what was happening. A crown is a symbol, but a state needs more than a symbol. It needs systems that keep working when confidence wavers. Courts, taxes, enforcement, predictable consequences. In my day, those systems still depended on the personal force of the king, and I was a king whose right was argued over in every hall. So I rode, and I kept writing. The first fire that demanded my presence burned in the southwest, Exeter. Baldwin de Redvers, powerful, ambitious, and not inclined to wait while England decided what it wanted, turned the city into a question I could not ignore. Exeter was strong, and strong places are dangerous in uncertain times. If it held out against the king, it taught other lords that the crown could be resisted without immediate cost. I went west not because I hungered for a spectacle, but because weakness spreads. A delayed response invites a second defiance. A second invites a third. Soon, a ruler is no longer a ruler, only the first among rivals. A siege is never as clean as stories make it. It isn't a single dramatic moment. It's carpenters and trenches, supply wagons and rationing, damp nights and quiet bargaining. It's an argument conducted in hunger and patience. And inside Exeter was a detail that made everything harder. Baldwin's wife, Adeliza, was connected to my own family through marriage ties. Blood complicates politics. It turns simple decisions into traps. If I pressed too hard, I risked turning the realm against me. If I pressed too softly, I taught the realm that my pressure meant nothing. So I offered terms. I listened. I waited. I tightened the ring, not with theatrical certainty, but with steady, practical control. In the end, Exeter yielded, but Baldwin slipped away, as men like him often do, leaving behind stone and promises, and carrying the problem into the landscape where it could rise again. I had taken the city, yes, but I had not taken trust, and without trust, victory has an expiration date. No sooner had the West quieted than the North began to move. My uncle Henry had kept borders calm largely through the sheer weight of his reputation. With him gone, old claims returned like wolves to a path that had briefly gone cold. David of Scotland, my wife's uncle, pious and shrewd, came south with an army. Some would later call him an invader. Others would say he was defending Matilda's rights. In truth, he was doing what capable rulers do, reading weakness and turning it into leverage. I marched north. This is where people misunderstand medieval kingship. They imagine a king as a man who issues commands and waits for the world to obey. But in my England, presence was policy. If I could appear quickly enough, I could prevent open defection without ever needing to test it. I met David, and we spoke the language of rulers who understand that war is not always the most profitable way to win. We negotiated. We traded concessions for time. Agreements were shaped, not glorious, not clean, but functional. Some of my men said I yielded too much. Perhaps I did. But consider the math of it, simple human math, not numbers on a page. If I fought a large war in the north, I risked losing the south. If I poured men and coin into one frontier, I invited revolt on another. I could not afford to gamble everything on a single battlefield, because my reign itself was already a gamble. And while I dealt with Scotland, the deeper illness of the kingdom continued to spread. Castles multiplied. Not always as open rebellion, often as security. A lord would say the roads were unsafe. Another would claim he needed stronger walls until the realm calmed down. They built without royal license, and those fortresses, stone and timber thorns across the countryside, were more than defenses. They were statements. They said plainly, "I will not trust the crown to keep me safe." From a modern perspective, it's a cycle you can recognize. Uncertainty makes people build private defenses. Private defenses weaken the center. A weakened center increases uncertainty, and the cycle tightens like a rope. I could see the rope forming. I could feel it on my throat. And still, breaking it required either more legitimacy than I possessed or more force than I could sustain without turning England into my enemy. By the time the year turned toward 1138, the outline of the long war was visible. Great men weighed their choices with careful faces. Robert of Gloucester, Henry's illegitimate son, powerful and respected, was not yet openly against me, but his loyalty had a peculiar quality. It felt like a hand resting near a dagger, not drawing it, but not far from it either. In the north, fighting flared again. The Battle of the Standard was fought without me, an English host led by northern lords resisting the Scots near Northallerton. They won, and people praised God, praised saints, praised the holy banners fixed to a wagon like a moving altar. When the reports reached me, I felt something I did not expect. Not relief, a warning. Because when victories happen without the king, they become proof that the kingdom can function without him. And for a ruler whose claim is contested, that is a dangerous kind of success. Around campfires and in town lanes, people began speaking of my sword again. They said the king carried a blade that could not break. I never announced such a thing. I never denied it either. A rumor is like smoke. If you swat at it, you spread it. But I understood why men wanted the story. England itself began to feel breakable. Promises were soft. Oaths were conditional. Borders were negotiable. Trust was thinning. People needed something firm. And if they could not believe the kingdom was unbreakable, they wanted to believe the king might be. Some nights, when the camp finally quieted, I would touch the sword belt as if the leather could anchor me to certainty, and I remembered an old line from a smith, spoken years before, as a blade cooled with a hiss. "Not for breaking," he'd said, "for holding." At the time, I thought he meant steel. Now I began to suspect he meant something else entirely. Because England was not asking me to win once and be done. England was asking me to hold, day after day, road after road, compromise after compromise, while the realm tested every hinge and seam to see where it might crack. And I rode on, faster than rest, because in those years I understood one hard truth. In a disputed reign, you don't get to be a king in one place. You have to be a king everywhere.
A war doesn't begin with a trumpet. It begins the moment you can't tell whether the men around you are loyal or simply waiting to see who pays better tomorrow. By the time the year 1139 arrived, I had learned to read a room the way a sailor reads the sea. Not by the loud words, but by the silence between them. Not by the smiles, but how late the smiles arrived. Everywhere I went, I felt the same undertow pulling England toward open conflict. Not because the realm adored Matilda more than me, or feared me more than her, but because our claims could not both be satisfied. And when the rules of inheritance are disputed, every ambitious man finds a way to profit from the uncertainty. If you look at it with a modern eye, you'll recognize the shape of it immediately. When the framework is weak, politics turns into a marketplace. Loyalty becomes a commodity. Ideals become packaging. The turning point, at least the one I can still feel in my bones, didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in a courtyard. The bishops. Early in my reign, I depended on them. The church was the closest thing England had to permanence, and bishops were not only spiritual men, they were administrators, judges, keepers of seals, the engineers of government. Roger of Salisbury, in particular, had been my Uncle Henry's great instrument of order. His family held offices and castles that made the machinery of rule work. And that was exactly what frightened me. Because in uncertain times, power inside the church could look like a private kingdom inside my own kingdom. Rumors reached my ear the way rumors always do, half-formed, confident, impossible to prove, dangerous to ignore. They said Roger and his relatives were fortifying. They said they were gathering arms. They said they were preparing to turn if Matilda landed. I will be honest with you. I do not know, even now, how much of that was true. But a disputed king rarely has the luxury of perfect information. He acts on fragments, and later generations judge the choice as if the full picture had been laid out neatly before him. At Oxford, I made my decision. Roger of Salisbury and other bishops were seized after a dispute that flared up quickly. One of those moments that looks accidental until you realize how useful it is to someone. Their castles were demanded. Their reach was cut back. In the short term, it felt like control, like a threat neutralized. In the long term, it was a fracture I could not easily mend, because I had shown the realm something it would remember. Even bishops were not safe from royal fear. I had taken men who wore sacred authority and treated them as political pieces. A chronicler might call it boldness. A modern analyst might call it a trade. Long-term trust exchanged for short-term security. Both are true. And once that kind of trust is broken, people do not rush to repair it. They simply begin planning around the damage. Then Matilda came. She landed in England later that year, not with a force large enough to overwhelm the realm at once, but with something more dangerous, a claim that could gather men like a storm gathers wind. She took refuge at Arundel Castle, under the protection of my uncle's widow, Adeliza of Louvain. When word reached me, my body reacted before my mind could dress it in royal calm. You can tell yourself a rival is distant until she is inside your kingdom, behind stone walls, with a name that men reconsider their oaths. I marched to Arundel expecting to end the problem quickly. That is what every ruler tells himself. Solve it early, solve it cleanly. But when I stood before that castle, strong walls, disciplined defenders, the cold certainty of stone, I felt something else move inside me. Not only anger, but recognition. Matilda was not a rumor anymore. She was a person inside that fortress. Henry's daughter, the living remainder of my uncle's intention. And she was also a woman in a world that would judge every one of my actions through the lens of custom and fear. If I seized her like a common rebel, what would England see? Some would see strength. Others would see sacrilege. Many would see a king terrified of a woman's claim. So I chose a path that has puzzled people ever since. I allowed her safe passage. I let her ride under escort to Bristol, where her greatest supporter, Robert of Gloucester, could shelter and build her cause. Even as I watched her party disappear down the road, I understood how it might look. Like foolish mercy. Like a door I had opened with my own hand, inviting the storm inside. In that moment, I told myself I was buying legitimacy, that mercy would look like confidence, that if I behaved like a rightful king, the realm would accept me as one. It's a very human mistake, and a very modern one too, the belief that a symbolic gesture can neutralize a structural conflict. It cannot. From then on, England stopped feeling like one kingdom and began feeling like two versions of the same land stitched together badly. A patchwork of loyalties, seams pulled tight, ready to tear. Castles rose across the countryside like thorns. Some were openly hostile. Many were simply precautions. Men claimed they were protecting roads, protecting families, protecting stores of grain. In truth, they were protecting themselves from uncertainty, and every new wall was a quiet statement that the king's protection could not be relied upon. The roads grew tense. Markets adapted. People learned to listen for hoofbeats and decide within a heartbeat whether those hoofbeats meant trade, taxes, or trouble. And my life became a series of moving emergencies. A dispute here, a threatened town there, a baron wavering somewhere else, a rumor of betrayal always on the edge of the map. I held councils, I issued charters, I promised order, I threatened consequences.
I rewarded loyalty. I punished defiance. And still the land kept sliding toward open war. This is the part the later word anarchy tries to capture. But the lived truth was subtler. Life did not collapse everywhere at once. Bread was still baked. Priests still said mass. Children still grew. But the feeling of a reliable center began to fade. And when predictability fades, fear moves in. Fear makes men build walls. Fear makes them change sides. Fear makes them believe in talismans. So the story of my sword grew. I heard it in soldier talk and court whispers. The king carries a blade that will not fail, a blade that holds when other things give way. I never claimed such a miracle. I never denied it either. A myth is like smoke. If you strike at it, you spread it. And in the quiet hours, when I was alone with candlelight and the weight of a crown that never quite felt settled, I would draw that sword and study it as if metal could answer questions that law and oaths could not. Sometimes I thought I heard a thin singing in the blade. Not magic, not truly, but the sound the mind invents when it is desperate for meaning. You might call it stress, or hope, or the strange comfort of ritual. Because the truth was this: the realm did not need an unbreakable sword. It needed an unbreakable center. And I could feel, even before Lincoln, that the center was beginning to crack, not with one dramatic blow, but with countless small fractures in trust. By the end,
there are mornings when the world feels arranged, when fog lies over the fields like a curtain and every sound seems rehearsed. The morning outside Lincoln felt like that. The air was too quiet, the ground too damp, the sky too pale. It was the kind of calm that makes you suspect the day is about to demand a price. I had come to Lincoln for what, in a calmer age, might sound like a private quarrel, a castle, a dispute among great men, another argument over who had the right to hold stone and authority. But in my England, castles were not simply walls. They were votes you could live inside. Lincoln Castle was held for my cause, at least in name, yet the men around it were never as fixed as the stone they claimed to serve. Ranulph of Chester, restless and calculating, had shifted and negotiated and shifted again. That was the rhythm of the time. This was not a board with clean sides. It was a table where everyone kept changing the rules mid-game. I began the siege because I could not afford to ignore the challenge. A king who lets a great lord take what he wants is no king at all, only the first among rivals. Then the warning came. A relief force was moving toward us. Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's most capable champion, was riding with Ranulph and others who had decided that my difficulty was their opportunity. My advisors urged caution. Some told me to withdraw, regroup, refuse a pitched battle. From a modern perspective, it's sensible. Conserve strength, choose the ground, avoid a gamble when the stakes are the entire crown. But a disputed king is not allowed to look cautious. In those days, caution and weakness were easily mistaken for the same thing, and weakness, once believed, spreads faster than truth. So I stayed. I rode out. The battle did not form like a neat line in a chronicle. It formed like weather. Banners surfaced and vanished in fog. The noise swallowed commands. You could not always see the enemy clearly. Sometimes you only felt movement and pressure, heard the crash of shields and the short, harsh breaths of men bracing themselves in mud. If you imagine medieval battle as a simple test of courage, you miss what it truly is, a test of systems under stress. Communications fail, plans dissolve, morale turns like the wind. A modern commander would recognize it immediately. Uncertainty multiplied by fear, managed through habit and leadership and luck. I fought on foot for much of it because I wanted my men to see me close. A king who stands among his household tells them, without speeches, that he shares the danger. And in a time when loyalty was rented and brittle, that mattered. This is the moment the storytellers love. They prefer a king at the center, shining, invincible, his sword flashing like a sign from heaven. They want the myth of the unbreakable blade. What happened at Lincoln was something more human and more revealing. My sword failed. Not with a thunderbolt, not with a dramatic curse. It failed the way weapons fail, under strain, under pressure, in the wrong moment, when physics does not care what men have promised in halls. Whether it cracked, bent, or simply became unusable doesn't change the truth of it. In that instant, I felt the world tilt, not because a tool had failed, but because I could hear inside my own head the sound of a legend collapsing. If you have ever built confidence around a story, about yourself, about how things must turn out, then you know the shock when reality touches that story and leaves a mark. For a heartbeat, I stood with the failure in my hand. Then I did what the moment required. I did not stop. I did not stare at broken metal as if it could apologize. I took up another weapon, an axe, as several accounts later remembered, and I continued. That detail matters. It is the hinge between myth and history. The later phrase, the blade that wouldn't break, is not supported by the battle itself. If anything, Lincoln shows the opposite. Metal can fail, and the man must decide whether he will fail with it. And perhaps that is why the legend survived it all. Not because people truly believed my sword was enchanted, but because they wanted to believe I did not fold when the plan collapsed. The struggle tightened. Hours passed in a blur of fog and movement, and then I began to feel something worse than exhaustion, something colder, isolation. Not the physical kind, you were never truly alone in a battle, but the political kind, the moment you realize the space around you is thinning of friends. Men retreat for many reasons, and afterwards they will always find words that sound respectable, but the effect is the same. The ring shrinks. I was urged to leave, to withdraw, to live and gather strength elsewhere. But withdrawal in that moment would have been read as the collapse of my claim. In civil war, perception can be deadlier than defeat. A king who runs invites a kingdom to run from him. So I remained. There is a strange calm that comes when you stop bargaining with fate. I felt it then. Not peace, never peace, but clarity. I was no longer thinking about next month or next year, or how chroniclers might frame my choices. I was thinking about the next minute. The field decided the rest. I was surrounded, pressed in, taken, not because I wished to yield, but because in a struggle like this, a living king can be more valuable than a dead one. A captured crown is a bargaining chip with a heartbeat. As they led me from the field, fog swallowed the shapes of the battle behind us. Somewhere, Lincoln's Hill rose through the haze, cathedral and castle watching like stone witnesses that never blink. And I understood what the day had proved. If the king can be captured, then the kingdom has no solid center. Once that truth is known, everyone begins acting as if the center will not hold. Barons hedge harder, castles multiply, bishops weigh every word, cities begin to calculate their own safety. Later, people would still speak of my unbreakable sword, but Lincoln was the day that taught me what mattered more than the blade. Everything can fail. The only question is what you do when it does. And now, with my sword's story shaken and my own freedom taken, I was about to learn what it means to hold on when you can no longer move at all.
Captivity does not begin with chains. It begins with silence. After Lincoln, the noise of command vanished. No messenger rushed in demanding judgment. No counsel waited for my decision. No petitioners lined the corridor hoping the king would fix what their local lords could not, or would not. For the first time in years, England did not orbit me. And that is when I learned the strangest thing about kingship. Much of its power is not force, but constant recognition, the steady daily agreement of thousands of people to behave as if your authority is real. Remove that agreement, and the world keeps moving without you. I was taken to Bristol, Robert of Gloucester's stronghold, kept under guard, treated with a careful mixture of respect and calculation. My captors did not need me dead. In a civil struggle, a living king is a piece on the board that can be traded. A dead king is only a problem. The days blurred. Captivity is designed to reduce a person to time. Meals, prayers, footsteps in the corridor, the scrape of a bolt. A room with stone walls teaches you patience the way winter teaches the body to conserve heat. Yet my mind did not quiet. It sharpened.
because when you cannot act, you can only interpret. While I sat in guarded chambers, the Empress moved quickly. In the spring of that year, she was received at Winchester. My brother, Henry of Blois, bishop, politician, and a man of remarkable agility, shifted toward her as churchmen sometimes do when they feel the wind changing. Matilda was acknowledged as Lady of the English, not crowned yet, but placed close enough to the throne that many assumed the next step was inevitable. This is where people often expect the story to resolve. The rightful heir triumphs, the usurper falls, order returns. But real crises rarely oblige clean storytelling. Matilda had something powerful, the lawful claim my coronation had contradicted. But she faced the same problem I had faced from the beginning, only turned inside out. It was not enough to be right, she had to be accepted. London, always decisive, remained wary. Barons watched her closely, not for her virtues, but for what her victory might mean for their lands and titles. The church offered support with one hand and conditions with the other. And many men, raised in a world that treated rule as a man's body, did not suddenly become comfortable with a woman's authority simply because the law said they should. To a modern viewer, it's painfully familiar. When power shifts, people dress discomfort in principles. They call it custom, stability, proper order. The words change, the fear does not. And Matilda, by many accounts, did not make the transition easy. Some chroniclers describe her as imperious, slow to forgive, unwilling to flatter. You should treat those descriptions with caution. Medieval writers punished strong women with words the way later ages would punish them with rumors. Still, one lesson seems clear. A civil war is not won only by defeating enemies. It is won by giving enemies a dignified way to stop being enemies. In June, when Matilda attempted to consolidate power in London, the city resisted. The moment that should have become her coronation became another turning point. She withdrew, and the aura of inevitability cracked. From my cell, I learned this as one learns weather from distant thunder, through the shifting expressions of guards, the sudden urgency of messengers, the way a door closes too quickly. And I realized something grim. England was not choosing between two rulers. England was failing to accept either fully. The throne had become a chair that no one could sit in without the legs wobbling. Then the force Matilda underestimated began to move. My wife. Matilda of Boulogne was not a figurehead. She had bloodlines, allies, and the kind of courage that does not require poetry. While I sat behind walls, she gathered support. She negotiated. She reminded barons, quietly, sharply, what a contested succession could do to inheritance and property. She held my cause together when my body was unavailable. With modern eyes, you might call it coalition management under extreme uncertainty. To me, it was survival. By late summer, the conflict tightened around Winchester. My brother, still balancing spiritual authority with political self-preservation, shifted again as the two camps collided. The city became a pressure point. Supplies, streets, loyalties, and pride all tangled together. This period is often reduced to a single phrase, the rout of Winchester. But what mattered was the outcome. Robert of Gloucester, the Empress's indispensable commander, was captured, and suddenly the war remembered its simplest arithmetic. A king for an earl, a living bargaining chip for another. Negotiations moved with grim efficiency. In the autumn, terms were shaped, and in November, I was released in exchange for Robert. When I stepped into open air again, it felt unreal, like rising after being held underwater. The wind had texture. The horizon looked too wide. Ordinary sounds, horses, voices, a cartwheel, felt extravagant, as if the world had been louder all along and I had forgotten. My supporters greeted me as if I had returned from the dead. I did not feel reborn. I felt recalibrated. Captivity teaches you what survives when symbols fail. When I held a blade again, whether the same sword or another mattered less than what it represented. I no longer thought in terms of Unbreakable. I thought of Lincoln. I thought of the instant metal failed and I had to continue anyway. And I understood the irony. The legend of my sword was already changing. People weren't truly insisting that my blade could never fail. Most men had seen enough war to know better. What they were really saying, what they needed to say, was something subtler. That the king did not stop when the weapon failed. That he continued when the plan failed. That he held when holding seemed impossible. A myth doesn't have to be literally true to become powerful. It only has to be useful. In a land exhausted by shifting loyalties, the idea of a ruler who stayed steady under collapse was worth more than perfect steel. When I returned to the orbit of the throne, England did not heal overnight. The cracks were still there, filled with the rubble of broken expectations. But I had learned what the crown could not protect me from. A crown is not a shield. A sword is not a miracle. And what truly doesn't break is rarely metal. It is the will to keep assembling order from fragments, again and again, while everyone watching, waiting to see if you will finally let it fall.
If you want to understand how my crown stayed on my head after Lincoln, don't begin with my victories. Begin with my wife. Matilda of Boulogne didn't rule through spectacle. She ruled through presence, through the unglamorous work of keeping people in the same room long enough to agree on the next step. In an age that praised saints and warriors, she practiced something rarer: coordination. When I returned from captivity, people expected a scene of relief, tears, embraces, celebration. What I remember most is the look on her face. Not softness, assessment. She looked at me the way a commander looks at a fort after a storm, counting what remains, deciding what must be rebuilt, weighing what can be spared. And in that look, I understood something I had been too proud to admit. The realm had not been held together by my name alone. It had been stitched together by her hands. Chroniclers love moments, crowns set in place, gates opened, great men kneeling. They have less interest in the quiet hours when loyalty is persuaded, bribed, reassured, or simply exhausted into cooperation. But those quiet hours were where my reign lived. While I was confined, my wife did what kings in my position often failed to do. She made loyalty feel safer than defection. She spoke to bishops in their language, to barons in theirs, and to soldiers in the only language that always matters: certainty about tomorrow's bread, tomorrow's wages, tomorrow's protection. And she did not pretend the world was noble. Once, after a long day of reports and petitions, I asked her how she had kept so many uncertain men from drifting away. She gave me a tired half-smile and said, "I didn't keep them. I gave them reasons to keep themselves." That was the difference between us, and I knew it. I wanted to reconcile, to forgive, to make enemies into allies with generous terms. In a stable kingdom, that could be a virtue. In a kingdom like mine, generosity without consequence could look like permission. My Uncle Henry had ruled by making fear predictable. Defy the crown, and you knew the cost. I was not built like that. I preferred agreements. I preferred second chances. I believed too often that people could be won by mercy. My queen understood what I had to learn the hard way. Mercy without structure teaches men to gamble again. "Each time you forgive without consequence," she said to me in private, "you teach them that the crown is negotiable." That line stung because it was true. And then came Oxford. In the winter of 1142, I moved against Matilda there, hoping, almost praying for the kind of clean ending that civil wars rarely grant. Oxford Castle was strong, and it sat in a place that mattered: roads, river, influence. If I could close that fist around her cause, perhaps the realm would finally accept what it resisted accepting. We invested the place. Winter set its teeth into the land. The ground stiffened, breath turned to vapor. You could feel time itself slowing, each day a test of supplies and patience. A siege is not one dramatic push. It's a discipline. It's carpentry, sentries, watchfires, rationing, and the grinding pressure of waiting. Inside those walls, Matilda was not a symbol. She was a person, cold, surrounded, and still dangerous. And then she slipped away. To hear it told afterward, it sounds like a tale meant for singers, a woman in white crossing snow, vanishing into the night as if the war itself refused to be solved. Even my enemies repeated the story with grudging admiration because it carried the taste of something larger than politics, fate, providence, the sense that the realm was being tested by forces no one fully commanded. From my side of the walls, it felt less like a miracle and more like a curse dressed as weather. We had tightened the net, and still the fish had passed through. My men were furious. Some blamed negligence, some blamed treachery, a few blamed God. But in my heart, I blamed the shape of the conflict itself. Because Oxford taught me something I did not want to admit. This war was not a knot that could be cut with one clean stroke. It was a fabric, pulled, torn, rekied, and pulled again. Every time I thought I had pinned down the ending slipped away and reappeared somewhere else. That is the hidden cruelty of a long civil war. It trains everyone to live without resolution. And through all of it, the story of my sword kept following me. At first, people spoke of an impossible blade, one that could not break, but too many had seen enough to believe in perfect metal, so the legend shifted into something more believable and more demanding. It became a story about me. Not that the blade was unbreakable, but that I was the man who held. That when fortune turned, at Lincoln, in captivity, in missed opportunities, I did not disappear. I understood why people needed that story. In uncertain times, communities cling to symbols the way cold hands cling to a warm stone. If the king appears steady, perhaps the roads will be steady. If the king endures, perhaps the realm can endure. But there is a trap inside that belief. Once people decide you are the man who held, you are not allowed to show fatigue. You are not allowed to confess doubt. You become a performance of certainty, even when certainty is impossible. And that performance becomes part of governance. There were nights I sat alone, candlelight trembling against stone, and I laid a hand on the sword belt, not because I believed in magic, but because I needed something solid, something that didn't argue back, something that did not shift sides. And I remembered an old line spoken years before by a smith with missing fingers and steady eyes. Not for breaking, for holding. At the time, I thought he meant the blade. In those years, I began to understand he might have meant the man. Because the real weapon of my reign was never steel. It was endurance. And England, fractured, exhausted, stitched together by my queen's relentless work, kept moving forward, not towards a glorious ending, but to the only kind of ending a wounded kingdom can accept. A workable one.
A long war changes what people believe is normal. At the start, everyone says, this cannot last. Then a year passes, and another. Children grow taller. Old men die. New walls rise on hillsides as if stone itself has learned to fear. And slowly, the extraordinary becomes routine. By the middle years of my reign, England had entered that dangerous phase. Not chaos everywhere, not the world ending in a single dramatic blaze, but uncertainty settling into daily life like damp into timber. Later writers would call it the Anarchy. It's a powerful word. It survives because it sounds like thunder. But living through it felt less like thunder and more like erosion, the slow wearing away of trust. Under my Uncle Henry, royal orders traveled like arrows, straight, fast, and feared. Sheriffs and judges acted with the confidence that the king's displeasure had sharp consequences. Under me, that confidence thinned, not because I lacked the desire to rule, but because my rule was contested. Every official had to wonder whether my crown would still be on my head next season, and if tomorrow might bring a different king, then today's obedience became a risk. So men hedged, they delayed, they bargained, they fortified.
Unauthorized castles multiplied across the countryside, small fortresses raised without the crown's leave. Some were timber, some stone, all of them statements. Each one said, without speaking, "I do not trust the center to protect me. I will protect myself." From a modern perspective, you might call it a breakdown in the state's control over force. To those of us living inside it, it felt simpler and harsher. I would ride into a shire and see stone rising where my permission had never been asked. When I ordered such fortifications dismantled, some obeyed, some delayed, some ignored me outright. And each time I had to negotiate obedience, I was reminded of the truth. The reach of the crown was shrinking. People often ask why I didn't simply crush my opponents once I was free again, why I didn't force a final decision. It's a natural question if you imagine the conflict as purely military, as if one decisive blow would settle everything. But the war was not only fought with men and horses, it was fought with geography, logistics, and the weakness of institutions. England was large, and roads were slow. Communication arrived late or not at all. Great lords held their own revenue, their own castles, their own private networks. Switching sides carried fewer permanent penalties than it would in a later, more centralized age. The church could shift its blessing, and blessing mattered. London, wealthy and proud, could make a claim feel real or make it feel hollow. Even when I won ground, holding it could cost more coin and men than I could afford, and whenever Matilda's side gained ground, they suffered the same problem. It was like trying to pin cloth to a wall. As soon as one corner is secured, another pulls loose. If castles were the stone of this long struggle, the church was its sky. Bishops and archbishops were not merely spiritual figures, they were stabilizers and negotiators. Their support could calm barons, or their disapproval could turn confidence into doubt. Men like Archbishop Theobald watched the realm with a careful patience, and my own brother, Henry of Blois, moved like a man balancing on a narrow beam above deep water, adjusting his stance whenever the wind changed. My relationship with the church became more complicated as the years dragged on. I had needed its blessing to be crowned, but I had also shown, early in my reign, that I could act harshly when afraid, arresting bishops, seizing castles. Even if those acts were politically rational, they left a residue. Distrust in the church does not remain private. It becomes hesitation. It becomes sermons. It becomes slow cooperation disguised as theological caution. And while institutions strained, the wider world pulled at the edges of the conflict. When the Second Crusade was called, some men of great standing departed, including Robert of Gloucester for a time. The pressure shifted, the tempo changed, but the war did not end. By then, it had become self-sustaining, like wheels that continued turning even after the hand that set them in motion is removed. To be king in those years was to live inside constant demand. Always traveling, always hearing petitions, always answering small emergencies with the urgency of large ones, because any neglected spark could become a fire in the mouths of rivals. I aged faster than I expected, not only in years, but in a feeling like living too long in smoke. There is a temptation for rulers in that position to become harsh. Harshness simplifies decisions. It makes consequences predictable. It feels efficient. But I was not built for cruelty. I tried instead to bargain, to reconcile, to make agreements that could outlast a season. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it taught men to press harder. And through it all, the legend that had formed around my sword stayed alive, not because anyone truly believed steel could defy the world, but because people needed something steady to lean on. The story changed over time. It stopped being about an impossible blade that never fails. Too many had lived long enough to know that nothing is invulnerable. Metal, vows, walls, kings. So the tale became about endurance, that Stephen held. That when fortune turned, at Lincoln, in captivity, in endless negotiations, I did not vanish. I returned. I continued. I kept trying to assemble order from pieces. That story helped my cause. It also trapped me. Because once the realm believes you are the man who holds, you are not permitted to look tired. You become a performance of certainty, even when certainty is the rarest thing on earth. As the years moved on, a new pressure grew, not from Matilda directly, but from time. My son Eustace needed a future. Supporters do not only support a man, they support a timeline. They want to know what comes next. I pushed for my son to be recognized, even crowned in my lifetime, to secure succession and prevent the chaos from beginning again the moment I died. But the church resisted. Archbishop Theobald hesitated. The refusal was framed in proper religious language, but it was politics too, because the realm was still contested, and blessing a successor too early could ignite the same fears all over again. I pressed. The church held firm. And then, in the year 1152, I lost the person who had held my cause together more than anyone, my queen. Her death did not arrive with a battle or a turning of banners. It arrived the way real losses arrive, quietly, and then all at once. And only after she was gone did I see how much she had been doing unseen. She had been my bridge to allies, my anchor in panic, my voice in rooms where my presence could not reach. When she died, it felt as if a load-bearing wall had been removed from a building I didn't realize was leaning so hard upon it. The war did not instantly change shape. That's how you know a person has been truly structural. Their work is invisible until it is absent. Afterward, I found myself staring longer at maps, listening less, speaking sharply than I intended. I began to understand that endurance is not infinite, not even for a king. And the realm, sensing weakness as realms always do, began to anticipate the next turn, because the struggle was still not resolved. And now, the future, my son's future, England's future, looked less like a straight road and more like a river in fog, flowing towards whatever shore would finally have the strength to hold it.
By the year 1153, the war had the tired smell of old smoke, so familiar people stopped noticing it until they stepped into a quieter place and realized how much it had stung their eyes. I had worn the crown for nearly 2 decades, of riding, bargaining, building alliances, losing them, rebuilding them, and trying again and again to make England behave like one kingdom. And then the future came back across the water. Henry, Matilda's son, landed in England once more, not as a boy searching for his first chance, but as a young man with the weight of Normandy and Anjou behind him, and the kind of momentum civil wars reward. When his banners appeared in reports, I felt a mixture of anger and exhaustion, not because I hadn't expected him, but because I had seen this shape before. A rival arrives, barons consider, bishops hesitate, London watches, and the realm begins to tilt. Yet something had changed. This time I could feel the kingdom itself resisting the tilt, not out of love for me, and not out of fear of Henry, but out of sheer weariness. England had grown tired of being a stage. I gathered my men, Henry gathered his. We moved across the land like 2 weather fronts, approaching, circling, testing. There were moments when a decisive clash seemed possible, even likely. In another age, a single battle might have settled everything. In our age, it was never only about blades. It was about what followed. Who could hold the roads, feed garrisons, keep cities calm, persuade the church, and give lords a reason to stop gambling? Barons who once chased advantage now urged caution. Men who had fortified their own hills began to realize that if the realm shattered completely, their titles might become meaningless. Even the most ambitious began to understand that a kingdom can be ruined so thoroughly that no one can truly win it. So, again and again, the moment of finality slipped away. To some, it looked like weakness, 2 leaders avoiding the test. From where I stood, it looked like exhaustion becoming wisdom. The country did not want another Lincoln. It had learned painfully that even victory could be a kind of catastrophe. But while England grew more cautious, my own household grew more tense because of my son. Eustace was no longer a child. He had watched his father spend years trying to nail certainty onto shifting ground, and he wanted what any heir wants, a guarantee.
I had pushed for him to be recognized, even crowned in my lifetime, to secure the future. In a stable realm, it might have been straightforward. In my realm, it was a spark near dry straw. The church resisted. Archbishop Theobald held firm. They would not easily bless a second coronation while the throne was still contested, while papal authority hovered, and while Henry's claim could not simply be erased by ceremony. The refusal was framed as spiritual caution, but it was politics too. Everyone understood that crowning Eustace would harden the war instead of ending it. My son took that refusal as humiliation, and he began to believe what ambitious men always believe when institutions fail to deliver certainty, that certainty must be forced into existence. I watched him harden, and it frightened me, not because he lacked courage, but because courage without patience becomes a storm. A storm can win you a moment and destroy your future in the same breath. Then, without warning, the storm in my household collapsed into silence. Eustace died. Not with a great scene worthy of storytellers, not in a way that matched the long struggle. He died suddenly, abruptly, like a candle pinched out by unseen fingers. I will not pretend I can describe that day cleanly. Grief is not a straight road. It is fog. It changes the shape of every memory it touches. My son had been difficult, impatient. At times he pushed me toward hardness I did not want, but he was also my future, my argument for continuity, my reason to believe the crown might become something stable rather than temporary. When he was gone, the war changed inside me. For years, my claim was tied to the promise of a son. Without that promise, my reign began to feel like a bridge that ended in open air. And the truth, brutal as winter, was this: a kingdom will not keep bleeding simply to protect a dead future. I sat with the news and found my hand drifting toward my sword belt, as if iron could explain what had happened. I did not draw the blade. I only held the hilt for a moment and felt the absurdity of asking metal to make sense of death. And then I understood something I had resisted for a long time. Peace was now possible, not because the claims were suddenly simple, but because the incentives had changed. The center of gravity shifted. The question was no longer how I could secure a dynasty. The question became how England could survive another generation. Negotiations moved with a force that felt almost unnatural, as if the war itself had been waiting for this hinge to turn. The talks at Wallingford and the agreements that followed were not romantic, they were practical. They were the language of exhausted men trying to prevent the realm from tearing again the moment one of us stopped breathing. The shape of the settlement emerged with grim clarity. I would remain king for the rest of my life. Henry would be recognized as my heir. My remaining son, William, would keep his lands. The castles razed unlawfully, the private fortresses that fed fear, would be dealt with, because the kingdom could not heal, while so many men lived behind walls built against their own king. To accept this was to concede what I had resisted since the day I crossed the Channel. My crown would not become a dynasty. Some will call that failure. Some will call it wisdom. I call it the only decision that stopped England from spending another generation trapped in the same wound. When I met Henry, when we stood facing each other with the careful stillness of men who know how easily history can become cruel, I saw more than an enemy. I saw an answer. He was young enough to be a new chapter, strong enough to make reluctant barons commit, skilled enough to build what I had struggled to maintain, a center that could hold. And I, older and worn by the years, understood a truth that comes late to many rulers. Being king is not always the same as being the kingdom's best hope. The old story of my sword survived anyway, changing shape as it traveled from mouth to mouth, not as a child's fantasy about perfect steel, but as a tale of endurance, that even when fortune turned, Stephen remained, Stephen held long enough for a workable peace to be built. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy I can claim. Not victory, not glory, but time. Time bought at a terrible price until England was finally ready to choose a future it could live with.
Peace doesn't arrive with a trumpet. It arrives like work. It's paperwork carried through wet streets. It's tired oaths spoken without pride. It's hostages returned, gates reopened, and roads slowly relearning how to feel safe. After the agreement that settled the succession, England began to exhale, but carefully, like someone testing a wounded rib. I remained king, yet the nature of my kingship changed. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to prove I was the future. I was trying to be a stable present. And that sounds simple until you live it. Because the moment a ruler becomes transitional, the world starts behaving as if he is already gone. Great men smile politely and begin placing their hopes on the next reign. Clerks arrange documents with an eye toward the next seal. Barons who once argued fiercely over my legitimacy begin speaking of continuity, as if they had always wanted peace. I didn't blame them. In truth, I understood them better than ever. After nearly 20 years of uncertainty, people were desperate for something they could plan around. In that final year, I traveled less. I listened more. I found myself thinking about repairs rather than victories, whether markets were recovering, whether local courts were functioning, whether coin was flowing again without being swallowed by private tolls and guarded bridges. If you want a modern phrase for it, it was post-war reconstruction. To us, it was simply the slow, aching work of making normal life possible again. But even as I tried to stabilize the present, the future kept pulling the realm forward. Henry, Matilda's son, had become the obvious next chapter, and England, tired of improvising, began to treat him like inevitability. You could feel it in small moments, the way a room subtly shifted when his name was spoken, the way decisions started to consider not only what I wanted, but what would be acceptable to the king who was coming. And here is the honest truth that kings rarely confess while they still breathe. Part of me felt relief. For years, my life had been lived inside a furnace of legitimacy. Every choice had been judged not only by its outcome, but what it implied about my right to exist as king. When the succession was settled, the furnace cooled. The air became clearer. I could see England not as a prize to be held, but as a living place that had paid too much for the ambitions of great families. Then, in the autumn of 1154, my own life ended. No final scene worthy of singers, no dramatic last stand, just a king worn down by years, leaving the world to the man the realm had agreed to follow. History often ends that way, not with a climax, but with a hand letting go. And that brings us back to the story people still ask about. The sword, the blade that wouldn't break. If you were hoping for a relic, for a preserved weapon you can point to and say with certainty this was Stephen's, there isn't one. No surviving sword can be proven beyond doubt to have been mine through an unbroken chain of evidence. What we have instead are texts, chronicles written with bias, loyalty, theology, and politics in their ink. Some praised me, some criticized me. All of them shaped events into meaning. So, was my sword unbreakable? Not in the way a legend wants. Iron is honest. Even the finest blade can fail. Bad angle, hidden flaw, relentless strain. And Lincoln taught that lesson clearly. My weapon failed there, and I continued with another. If anything deserves to be remembered from that day, it isn't the sword that never breaks. It's the king who didn't stop when it did. That is how myths survive contact with reality. They change shape. People don't cling to a story because it is literally true. They cling to it because it helps them endure the world they're trapped inside. In my reign, England was trapped inside uncertainty, weak institutions, contested succession,
private fortresses rising like weeds. In such a landscape, symbols grow heavier than they should. A crown becomes more than a crown. A sword becomes more than a tool. They become something people can lean on emotionally when the ground feels unstable. If you look at it with modern eyes, the legend makes perfect sense. When institutions are fragile, people search for certainty in personalities and symbols. When daily life is unpredictable, communities hunger for stories that make suffering feel coherent. Stories that say someone is holding the line, someone is steady, someone is real. And when the facts contradict the story adapts. It stops claiming the blade is perfect and starts claiming the man endured. So the sword became a mirror, reflecting what people needed me to be. Not invincible, not even always victorious, just steady enough that the kingdom might not tear itself apart completely. And here, at the end, I will tell you what I believe now, what I could not have admitted when I still wore the crown with my heart racing. The tragedy of my reign was not that I lacked courage. The tragedy was that England lacked a system strong enough to survive a disputed succession without turning itself into a battlefield of bargains. A king could ride faster, punish harder, forgive more generously, but none of that fully replaces institutions that can outlive a ruler's breath. Still, if I am allowed to claim one quiet achievement, it is this: the realm did not dissolve. It strained, it cracked, it suffered, but it endured long enough for a settlement to form that most could accept. I held on long enough for England to choose a future that could actually function. In the end, what didn't break was not a sword. It was the stubborn idea that England could still be one kingdom after everything tried to make it many. And sometimes when I think back to that old smith, 2 fingers missing, eyes steady, I hear his words again, as if spoken over cooling metal, meant not for glory, but for survival. Not for breaking, for holding.